Today is Saturday, March 7, 2026. And depending on where you're listening to this right now, you might have already noticed the price at the pump creeping up this morning.
Oh, absolutely.
Or maybe you've just been looking at your phone over your morning coffee, just staring at the absolute flood of chaotic, seemingly contradictory headlines lighting up your screen. If you're feeling a profound sense of whiplash today, you are absolutely not alone. We are standing exactly 1 week into a global event that has fundamentally shifted the tectonic plates of geopolitics, the military balance of the Middle East, and, well, the global economy.
It really is a watershed moment. It's the kind of week that historians are going to be dissecting for decades.
Yeah.
What we're seeing unfold is not just, another regional conflict or localized skirmish. It is a massive, highly coordinated, and incredibly devastating military campaign. And because of the specific geography involved here, the shockwaves of this campaign are instantly reverberating through literally every sector of the global economy. We're talking about everything from maritime shipping lanes and international insurance markets down to the actual tangible cost of the groceries on your kitchen table and the energy heating your home.
Exactly. And that is exactly why we are here today. Today's deep dive is dedicated entirely to cutting through that dense fog of war. We are looking at a highly detailed, incredibly meticulous compilation and timeline from a blog titled Barack Face. The post is called Iran Endgame Scenarios, and it was published just yesterday, March 6.
And this is not your average news summary.
Not at all. The source aggregates verified military reports, hard economic data, global shipping logs, and a really wide array of competing media narratives to map out the first 7 days of what is now officially being called Operation Epic Fury, the 2026 Iran War.
And our mission for this deep dive is to synthesize all of that complex, really fast-moving data for you. We need to look under the hood of this conflict. We're going to unpack the conflicting strategies of the nations involved, analyze the staggering, almost hard-to-comprehend military math of the past week, and crucially, explain how a 21-mile wide stretch of water halfway across the world is about to directly impact your wallet, your long-term investments, and the broader global economy.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to understand the sheer scale of the bombings that started last week, we can't just start on day one of the operation. We have to rewind the clock. We need to look at the chain reaction that brought us to this boiling point, because this didn't just happen out of nowhere. The material traces the roots of this current explosion all the way back to October 7, 2023.
Yeah, the anchor point.
Right, that was the day Hamas attacked Israel, killing 1,200 people and taking 250 hostages. Now, obviously, that sparked the brutal Israel-Hamas war. But for the timeline of this specific conflict with Iran, why is October 7 the anchor point?
It's the anchor point because October 7 essentially lit the fuse on what had previously been a shadow war. Let's define that, because for years, Israel and Iran had operated in this unspoken, highly volatile gray zone. They didn't fight directly. Instead, it was this murky world of covert operations, assassinations of nuclear scientists, complex cyber attacks, and proxy skirmishes.
Yeah.
Iran has spent decades building what's called the axis of resistance.
Right, the proxy network.
Exactly. This is a massive proxy network.
And when we say proxy network, for anyone unfamiliar, we're talking about militant groups funded, trained, and armed by Iran, but operating in other countries. So Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, various militias in Iraq and Syria. Iran uses them to project power without technically putting Iranian troops on the battlefield.
Precisely. It gives Iran plausible deniability. But the events following October 7 activated that entire proxy network simultaneously. Hezbollah started firing rockets into northern Israel. The Houthis started attacking commercial shipping in the Red Sea. The shadow war was suddenly being dragged out into the blazing sunlight. The unwritten rules of engagement were fraying rapidly. And if we follow the timeline, the first major structural crack in that shadow war taboo happened a few months later, in April of 2024.
Yes, the April 2024 exchange. This was a massive moment. Israel launched an airstrike on an Iranian consulate building in Damascus, Syria, killing several highly ranking Iranian generals. And then for the first time in history, Iran retaliated directly from its own soil. They didn't use a proxy. They fired over 300 missiles and drones straight at Israel.
It was a huge escalation.
It really was. Now, I remember covering this at the time. Most of those projectiles were intercepted by Israel and its allies. And Israel's military response to that wave was relatively limited. They basically just hit some Iranian air defense systems to send a message. But the precedent was set, wasn't it?
The precedent was fundamentally altered. The taboo of direct state-on-state fire between Israel and Iran was broken. Once you cross that psychological and diplomatic threshold, it is incredibly difficult to go backward. It normalizes the unthinkable. And historically, in military escalations, once the threshold is crossed, the next clash is inevitably going to be far more severe because both sides feel they have to establish dominance. And that brings us to the event the timeline identifies as the 12-day war in June of 2025.
The 12-day war. This is an absolute paradigm shift. In June 2025, Israel decided the shadow war was officially over, and they launched preemptive strikes directly on Iranian nuclear sites. We're talking about highly fortified facilities like Natanz and Fordo, along with major military bases and command centers.
And hitting those nuclear facilities is no small feat. A place like Fordo was built deep inside a mountain, heavily fortified specifically to withstand aerial bombardment. So the fact that Israel was going after these targets indicated they were willing to risk everything to degrade that nuclear infrastructure. But the true pivot point of that June 2025 conflict happened on June 21st.
All right, June 21st, 2025. That is the day the United States officially joined the kinetic strikes. And just to be clear on the terminology, when we say kinetic strikes, we mean actual physical explosive force dropping bombs and firing missiles, as opposed to cyber warfare or economic sanctions. The U.S. stepped in and hit 3 major nuclear facilities: Natanz, Fordo, and Isfahan.
A massive escalation of U.S. involvement.
Huge. The claim from Washington at the time was that this combined U.S.-Israeli operation set Iran's nuclear program back by months. But let's look at the actual data points for that 12-day war, because the numbers really set the stage for what is happening today. Iran fired around 500 missiles during that June conflict, but look at what they lost. As a result of the U.S. and Israeli strikes, Iran's total missile arsenal was reduced by 1/3 to 1/2.
That's a staggering loss of inventory.
And it wasn't just the missiles. Their missile launchers, the actual vehicles and silos needed to fire the weapons, dropped from around 480 down to roughly 100.
And that data right there is crucial to understanding the power dynamic. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the June 2025 conflict fundamentally degraded Iran's conventional deterrent. Think of a military's deterrent like a shield. If you lose half your arrows and nearly 80% of the bows required to shoot them, your shield is shattered. You lose the ability to project credible threats. So a ceasefire was called on June 24, 2025, but it wasn't a real resolution. It was merely a pause for breath. Both sides went back to their corners to reevaluate.
Which brings us to the immediate prelude of where we are right now, covering late 2025 and the first 2 months of 2026. The United States and Iran essentially tried to put the genie back in the bottle. They attempted to resume back-channel nuclear talks in Oman, but those talks stalled out completely. They officially collapsed with no resolution just a little over a week ago on February 26, 2026.
And while those diplomats were sitting in air-conditioned rooms in Oman getting absolutely nowhere, the actual physical reality on the ground was shifting rapidly. Let's look at the Iranian side. Despite crippling sanctions and a damaged infrastructure, Iran had managed to rebuild its missile production capacity to about 100 missiles a month. That is a significant industrial effort. However, even with that production, they remained fundamentally weakened compared to their pre-2025 strength.
And internally, Iran was a powder keg. While they're trying to rebuild their military, massive civilian protests erupted inside the country over severe economic crises, massive inflation, and political repression. The regime was facing deep structural instability from its own citizens. Meanwhile, on the other side of the geopolitical chessboard, the United States wasn't just waiting around, they were initiating a massive troop buildup in the Middle East. The source notes this was the largest deployment of American military force to the region since the 2003 Iraq invasion.
And this convergence of factors is exactly how diplomatic stagnation predictably explodes into kinetic warfare. Look at the ingredients in the pot. You have a severely weakened, increasingly paranoid regime that is simultaneously facing an internal revolt from its own people. Surrounding them, you have a massive historic concentration of hostile, advanced military hardware. And finally, you have the complete collapse of diplomatic off-ramps in Oman. The basic math of deterrence simply breaks down at that point. When there's no diplomatic path forward and the pressure is building internally and externally, that massive buildup of military force practically guarantees a spark will ignite it.
Which brings us to the trigger point, the exact moment the world changed. According to the timeline on February 27, 2026, at 8:38 p.m. Coordinated Universal Time, President Trump officially orders Operation Epic Fury. And the sheer shock and awe of day one, February 28, is genuinely difficult to comprehend. At around 6:20 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, the U.S. and Israel launch a synchronized, devastating wave of approximately 900 strikes.
I want to really pause on that number for a second. 900 distinct airstrikes in a single, synchronized opening wave.
It's hard to even picture.
To put that in perspective, that is a mind-boggling logistical achievement. That requires hundreds of aircraft, drones, naval assets, and satellite intelligence all working in perfect concert. And the objective here was entirely different from what we saw in 2025. In 2025, the goal was degrading hardware, hitting the nuclear sites and the missile silos. The material makes it very clear that while they did hit nuclear sites, missile facilities, and air defenses in this opening salvo, the primary defining characteristic of day one was leadership decapitation.
The list of casualties from those day one decapitation strikes is unprecedented. It reads like the entire upper echelon of the Iranian state. The strikes killed Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei in Tehran. They killed the IRGC commander, Hossein Salami. And let's clarify that real quick. When we say IRGC, we're talking about the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. This isn't just the regular Iranian army.
Not at all.
The IRGC is a massive elite paramilitary force that essentially controls Iran's ballistic missile program, its proxy networks, and huge swaths of the Iranian economy. It is the ideological enforcement arm of the regime.
Exactly. It's a state within a state.
Right. So they kill the supreme leader, they kill the head of the IRGC, they kill the defense minister, Amir Nasir Zada, along with at least 5 other senior military commanders. There are even reports that members of Khamenei's own family were killed in the strikes. It was a surgical, systemic elimination of the absolute top tier of the Iranian power structure, executed in a matter of hours.
The psychology and the military doctrine behind a move like this is fascinating and deeply risky. In military strategy, total systemic decapitation is the ultimate roll of the dice. By instantly removing the central nervous system of the regime, the supreme leader and the head of the IRGC, the U.S. and Israel were attempting to induce immediate systemic paralysis. The working assumption is that in a highly centralized authoritarian regime, power flows strictly from the top down. Without the head, command and control shatters. Orders cannot be relayed. The defensive response becomes fractured, localized, and ultimately uncoordinated. You are hoping the body simply collapses without the brain.
But the body did respond immediately, albeit frantically. The timeline notes that despite the decapitation of their leadership, Iran managed to launch a massive retaliatory wave. They fired between 150 to 200 missiles at Israel, 140 at the United Arab Emirates, and 63 at Qatar. And they were explicitly targeting U.S. military bases located in Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE. Airspace across the entire Middle East was immediately closed. Commercial flights were grounded or diverted. The UN stepped in to urgently condemn the strikes and call for calm, but the die was already cast.
That retaliatory volley is a crucial data point. It shows that even with the head severed, the autonomic nervous system of Iran's military could still fire. The localized commanders still had the authority, or at least the instinct, to launch their remaining assets. But as we move into days 2 through 4 of the operation March 1st through March 3rd, we see the true impact of the decapitation strategy take hold. We see the U.S. and Israel rapidly, systematically achieving total operational dominance.
The degradation of Iran's capabilities over those 72 hours is staggering. By day 2, Allied strikes had taken out roughly 300 Iranian missile launchers. They also heavily targeted Iranian naval bases, specifically sites like Chabahar Port on the Gulf of Oman. And by day 3, a critical tactical milestone was reached, according to the military reports. Allied forces achieved total air dominance over western Iran.
And we need to explain what air dominance actually looks like on the ground, because it is the most terrifying phrase a ground commander can hear. Air dominance doesn't just mean you have more planes. It means you have completely dismantled the enemy's air defense systems, their radar, their surface-to-air missiles, their early warning networks. It means coalition aircraft can fly over Iranian territory with near impunity. They own the sky, and once you own the sky, you control everything that moves on the ground.
And the impact of that air dominance is immediately mathematically visible in the data. On day 3, Iranian retaliatory attacks dropped by an astonishing 23%. And by day 4, Iranian missile fire was down 86% overall.
An 86% drop.
Just think about that. In less than 100 hours, the offensive capability of a major, heavily armed regional power was suppressed by almost 90%. That's not just losing a battle. That's like a heavyweight boxer having their arms tied behind their back by the second round. Iran was forced to formally devolve military command powers to local provinces just to survive, hoping decentralized units could hide and fight. Meanwhile, the U.S. was publicly warning that the hardest hits were still to come.
That 86% drop in return fire in 4 days proves that the decapitation and degradation strategy worked exactly as mathematically modeled by coalition planners. Once air dominance is achieved, you are no longer fighting a traditional war of attrition. You are essentially executing a demolition operation. The skies belong to the coalition. Anytime an Iranian unit attempts to move a mobile missile launcher out of a reinforced bunker, anytime they try to fuel a rocket, they are seen by satellite or drone and destroyed before they can even initiate a launch sequence. The military apparatus is blinded and paralyzed.
That leads us right into days 5 through 7, leading up to yesterday, March 6th. The sheer volume of firepower deployed to maintain that paralysis is staggering. The data shows the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces alone, dropped over 6,500 bombs in the first week. The U.S. military focused heavily on the waters of the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, sinking more than 20 Iranian naval vessels. And at this point, the geopolitical shockwaves are hitting capitals all over the world. The material notes the immediate responses from other superpowers. Russia stepped in to provide intelligence to Iran, specifically to help them target U.S. troops. Meanwhile, China begins urgently pressing for an immediate ceasefire.
And those polarized reactions from Moscow and Beijing are incredibly telling. They reveal exactly how a regional war instantly becomes a proxy battle for global influence. Look at Russia's motivation. Russia is currently bogged down in its own extended conflicts and faces massive Western sanctions. Russia thrives on U.S. distraction. If the U.S. is pouring billions of dollars, aircraft, and intelligence assets into a prolonged war in the Middle East, that is resources diverted away from Europe. So providing satellite intelligence to Iran to help them strike U.S. bases makes cynical strategic sense for Moscow. They want to prolong the conflict and bleed U.S. resources.
Right, and then you look at China, and their motivation is entirely different.
Exactly. China is the world's largest importer of crude oil. They are deeply structurally reliant on Middle Eastern energy flows to power their manufacturing sector and keep their economy afloat. A destabilized Persian Gulf and a massive war-disrupting energy markets is an active existential threat to the Chinese economy. Hence, their immediate diplomatic push for a ceasefire. It brilliantly highlights how this conflict immediately polarized the global superpowers based entirely on their own economic and strategic vulnerabilities. Now, before we go any further, and as we look at these three distinct strategies driving the conflict from the U.S., Israel, and Iran, it's really important for us to pause and note how we are approaching this. Right, the disclaimer.
Exactly. We are about to look at highly charged political rhetoric and aggressive military strategies. We want to be absolutely clear to you listening. We're just analyzing the playbook here. We are looking objectively at what the source material says these leaders are aiming to do and the framing they are using to justify their actions. We are not taking sides. We are not endorsing these goals, and we are not validating this intense rhetoric. We are strictly acting as your guides to untangle the strategies presented in the compiled data.
That context is vital because the rhetoric driving these military actions is absolute, and the stated goals are maximalist. Let's start with the United States strategy. According to the source compilation, the rhetoric from U.S. leadership, specifically President Trump, Marco Rubio, and Pete Hegseth, outlines a deeply aggressive posture. The stated goals are not just containment. They are explicitly aiming to prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons, entirely destroy their conventional military capacity, and achieve explicit regime change to, in their words, free the Iranian people from the Ayatollahs.
And yet, while pushing for regime change, the U.S. leadership is also explicitly stating there will be no forever war like we saw in Iraq or Afghanistan. However, they are simultaneously prepping the American public for an operation lasting months if necessary. Tactically, the material outlines their timeline very clearly, and it matches the data we just discussed. Step 1, degrade the air defenses, which they achieved by day 3. Step 2, eliminate the missile stockpiles and naval capabilities, which they are doing right now. And remarkably, the reports indicate they have not explicitly ruled out deploying ground troops, noting that the military coordination with Israel is unprecedented.
If we look at the Israeli strategy, it is tightly aligned with the U.S. objectives, but it is framed slightly differently for their domestic audience. Prime Minister Netanyahu frames the operation as removing existential threats, specifically the nuclear program which Israel has viewed as a red line for decades, the ballistic missiles capable of hitting Tel Aviv, and the proxy network that physically surrounds Israel's borders. But crucially, Israel is also seeking the total ouster of the Islamic Republic regime. The material notes that Israel's strikes are explicitly targeting the entire leadership structure. Furthermore, analysts suggest Netanyahu is using this as a moment to test U.S. resolve, locking the U.S. into a decisive month-long campaign to permanently alter the balance of power in the Middle East.
So you have the U.S. and Israel completely aligned on the ultimate goal, the collapse of the Iranian regime. Now, how does the Iranian regime respond to a coalition that moans the sky and is actively trying to erase their leadership? The compilation breaks down the Iranian strategy, currently driven by figures like President Pezeshkian and Abbas Araghchi, who survived the initial strikes. Their public stance is absolute defiance. No surrender, no interest in a ceasefire, and active preparation for a ground invasion.
And this is where we get into the concept of asymmetrical warfare. Because Iran is facing total air dominance, and because they have lost 86% of their missile firing capacity, they cannot fight a conventional force-on-force war. It would be suicide. Their strategy has to be entirely asymmetrical, meaning using unconventional tactics to exploit the vulnerabilities of a superior enemy. As we mentioned, they have devolved military powers to local provinces. If the central brain in Tehran is dead, they are letting the limbs fight independently. They are attempting to hide and save whatever advanced weapons they have left. They are heavily leveraging their surviving proxy forces like Hezbollah and the Houthis to cause chaos in other theaters. But most importantly, their entire survival strategy relies on their ultimate trump card, threatening the global oil flow through the Strait of Hormuz.
Here's where it gets really interesting. And this is the part where I want to talk directly to you, the listener, because you might be listening to this breakdown of military tactics and wondering, okay, but why should I care about a 21-mile stretch of water located between Iran and Oman? How does that affect me? It sounds like a geographic trivia question, but I assure you it is the most vital, vulnerable artery in the entire global economy.
The geography and the sheer math of the Strait of Hormuz are truly staggering. When we call it a global choke point, we aren't exaggerating. To put it in perspective, this single narrow waterway at its narrowest point, the shipping lanes are only 2 miles wide in either direction, handles approximately 20 to 25% of the world's entire seaborne oil trade. That equates to about 20 million barrels of crude oil moving through that water every single day. Furthermore, it handles 20% of all global liquefied natural gas, or LNG, shipments. The entire modern world runs on the energy that squeezes through that tiny gap.
So, when Iran threatens to close the Strait of Hormuz, they aren't just threatening a few cargo ships. They are threatening to suffocate the global energy supply. And according to the source material, as of March 6, that threat is no longer theoretical, it is reality. The Strait of Hormuz is effectively closed to commercial traffic. The data shows maritime traffic has plummeted by 70%. Right now, there are between 150 and 250 massive cargo vessels, oil supertankers, and LNG carriers just stranded or stalled out in the region, completely unable to move safely.
And it isn't just an empty threat keeping those massive ships at anchor. The compiled reports confirm that at least 3 commercial vessels have been damaged by suspected Iranian projectiles or naval mines, and tragically, 2 commercial seafarers have been killed. Consequently, the U.S. Navy has officially designated the strait a high-risk zone.
And let's explain how maritime insurance works in a scenario like this, because that is the hidden mechanism that actually stops global trade.
Exactly. When you combine physical damage to ships, the loss of human life, and official military warnings, commercial shipping simply ceases to exist in that space. It isn't just that captains are scared to sail, it's that the maritime insurance underwriters in London look at the risk profile and pull the plug. They either refuse to insure vessels traveling through the strait, or they jack up the war risk premium so astronomically high that it becomes economically impossible to move the cargo. The insurance market freezes, and therefore the ships drop anchor.
And the global economic ripple effect of this closure was immediate and violent. The compilation outlines the macroeconomic fallout we are already seeing just 1 week into the conflict. Crude oil prices have surged 10 to 13% in a matter of days, pushing Brent crude to $82 a barrel, which is a 14-month high. But the truly terrifying part is the projection. Energy analysts are predicting that if this closure persists, if this choke point remains blocked for weeks, oil could skyrocket to anywhere between $100 and $150 a barrel.
Let's trace how a massive price spike like that actually walks down the economic ladder and hits the listener's daily life. Because it isn't just about paying an extra dollar at the gas pump, though that happens almost instantly. When the price of crude oil and LNG spikes, it acts as a tax on the entire global economy. The cost to power manufacturing plants, to heat residential homes, and to transport goods physically skyrockets. We're looking at massive, immediate spikes in winter heating costs, particularly in Europe and Asia, which heavily rely on that Qatari LNG that is now physically trapped behind the blockade in the Gulf.
And it disrupts the physical movement of every single thing you buy because the strait is closed. Massive global shipping conglomerates like Maersk, Ciasco, and CMA, CGM have suspended all bookings to 7 Gulf countries. But it's worse than that. The ships that were meant to move through the Suez Canal and the Middle East to get from Asia to Europe are now being forced to reroute all the way around the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope.
Let's visualize what that rerouting means. You are adding roughly 3,000 to 4,000 nautical miles to a journey. That adds anywhere from 10 days to 3 weeks to transit times. A massive container ship burns tons of extra bunker fuel for every extra day at sea. The cost of that fuel is passed on. The insurance premiums for a longer, riskier voyage are passed on. The supply chain delays mean factories in Germany or the U.S. don't get their parts on time, so manufacturing slows down.
Suddenly, the cost of the electronics you buy, the clothes, the fertilizer needed for agriculture, it all goes up. And this creates a macroeconomic nightmare for governments because this level of logistical disruption feeds directly into global inflation. Just when the world thought it had tamed post-pandemic inflation, this conflict reignites it. And when inflation spikes, central banks like the Federal Reserve are forced to react. They have to delay planned interest rate cuts, or they might even be forced to tighten policy further and raise rates. So because a ship is stalled in the Gulf of Oman, your mortgage rate stays high, your credit card interest goes up, and borrowing money becomes harder. It severely slows global economic growth and genuinely risks plunging vulnerable economies into a full-blown recession.
And the deep, tragic irony of this entire strategy, as the source points out, is that by closing the Strait of Hormuz, Iran is totally destroying its own primary source of export revenue. The regime relies on illicit oil sales to fund itself. By blocking the waterway, they are inflicting massive catastrophic economic pain on their own country just to ensure they hurt the rest of the world in the process. It is the definition of a pyrrhic, desperate tactic.
It is a breathtakingly high-stakes gamble, and while all of this heavy, kinetic military action and macroeconomic maneuvering is happening in the physical world, there is a totally different kind of war happening simultaneously on your screens. The material compiles a fascinating list of YouTube video titles from the past week that perfectly capture the information war. It shows exactly how the media, independent creators, and state propagandists are trying to frame this chaos for the public.
The media framing is a battlefield in itself. In the modern era, conflicts are fought on the ground but won or lost in the court of global public opinion. When an event is this complex, this overwhelming, people naturally look for narratives that fit their pre-existing worldview or political biases.
Exactly. Just listen to some of these video titles captured in the compilation to see the stark polarization. You have videos titled "Iran's Regime Won't Fall," right next to "America's Regime Change Strategy Will Backfire." Then you have sensationalist breaking news titles like "Largest Bombing Campaign on Iran Happens Tonight," paired with macroeconomic dread like "Iran War Creates Chaos in the World Economy." You can see the algorithm feeding pure polarization. The source notes that essentially two wildly competing military narratives have emerged online to explain what is happening on the ground.
Yes, and evaluating those two narratives against the hard data we've discussed is crucial for understanding reality. Narrative A is essentially what the U.S. and Israeli governments are projecting, that Iran's military is effectively wiped out. The argument here is straightforward. The regime has lost 90% of its strike capacity, its air defenses are gone, its leadership is dead, and its operational situation is rapidly, irreversibly deteriorating.
Then you have narrative B, which is heavily pushed by contrarian channels, anti-interventionist commentators, and amplified by Iranian state messaging. Narrative B argues that Iran is actually playing four-dimensional chess. This narrative claims Iran is purposely holding back, that they are intentionally absorbing the Allied blows to save their most lethal, advanced weapons in deep underground bunkers, while simultaneously depleting the incredibly expensive interceptor missiles of the U.S. and Israel. It's the classic, we aren't losing, we're just executing a tactical rope-a-dope, waiting for the perfect moment to strike defense.
But the source material does a rigorous, data-driven evaluation of these two narratives, and it concludes that the hard evidence overwhelmingly supports narrative A. The math simply does not support narrative B's idea of a brilliant tactical pause.
How so? Walk us through the math.
Think about the mechanics of the 4D chess argument. If Iran were truly executing a tactical pause to drain Allied resources, we would expect to see signs of Allied interceptor shortages, meaning Israel and the U.S. were running out of the missiles needed to shoot down incoming fire. That would validate Iran's strategy. But the military reports explicitly state there are no major interceptor shortages reported by the coalition. Furthermore, let's look at the human and hardware cost. You do not intentionally allow 300 of your own expensive, hard-to-replace missile launchers to be destroyed as part of a ruse. You do not allow your supreme leader and your top military commanders to be assassinated as part of a tactical rope-a-dope strategy. The 86% drop in Iranian firing over 4 days is not a strategic pause. It is the direct mathematical result of severe, catastrophic military degradation.
So what does this all mean? Where does this actually end? We have a degraded regime, a closed global shipping lane, and an aggressive allied coalition. The compilation doesn't just give us the data of the past week, it actually models out the potential endgame. And it provides 4 distinct scenarios for how the collapse of the Iranian regime could play out, noting an important caveat. While the regime's internal security apparatus is currently cohesive, it is deeply structurally weakened by the decapitation strikes.
What's fascinating here is how these scenarios provide a realistic, analytical timeline for what regime change actually looks like in practice. Regime change is rarely a single cinematic moment where a statue is pulled down. It is usually a messy process of structural failure. The first scenario the source outlines is called leadership damage and defection. The logic here is that sustained decapitation strikes, continuing to kill the replacements of the top commanders, will eventually fracture the IRGC and the Basi.
Let's define the Besiege quickly. The Besiege is a massive, volunteer paramilitary force operating under the IRGC. They are the regime's primary tool for domestic suppression. They are the ones in the streets beating protesters and enforcing the strict ideological codes.
Exactly, they are the enforcers. And the theory in scenario 1 is that if the command structure of the IRGC and the Besieged shatters from constant airstrikes, the morale of the lower ranks will break. The rank-and-file soldiers will realize they are fighting a lost cause, and they will defect or simply abandon their posts. If the coalition strikes maintain this intensity, the analysis projects this internal fracturing taking roughly 2 to 6 weeks.
The second scenario focuses less on the psychology of the troops and purely on the hardware, military degradation. If that 86% reduction in capability we talked about hits 100%, the regime becomes completely physically isolated and defenseless. Without drones or missiles to project power regionally or to suppress major threats internally, they are a sitting duck. The projected timeline for the scenario is a bit longer, estimating 1 to 3 months, as the Allied strikes methodically, day by day, halt any attempts by Iran to rebuild their launchers or fuel their weapons.
The third scenario shifts the focus entirely away from the military and looks at the Iranian populace. Mass protests. We already know there were massive nationwide protests violently suppressed by the regime in 2025 and early 2026. The underlying anger is boiling. If those civilian protests surge again while the state security forces, the Besiege and the IRGC, are fractured, demoralized, and distracted by the Allied bombing campaign, the regime could be overwhelmed from the inside out. With no unified, organized counterforce to stop them, a civilian uprising could topple the government very rapidly. The source estimates this could happen in a matter of weeks if the momentum catches fire amid the wartime chaos.
And the fourth scenario looks at the day after the collapse, the transitional government. If the regime implodes through any of the first 3 scenarios, there is a massive power vacuum. To prevent total anarchy, an external figure the compilation specifically mentions, Reza Pahlavi, the exiled crown prince of Iran, being floated as an option by some factions, could be recognized internationally to step in and attempt to stabilize the country. But the timeline here is deeply sobering. Even if the regime falls quickly, establishing a stable, functional transitional government capable of providing security and basic services would take months. And a full transition to any form of democratic governance would take years if it succeeds at all.
It's important for us to weigh those analytical timelines against the political rhetoric we discussed earlier. Leaders like Trump and Netanyahu are projecting a 4 to 6 week operation to their publics. They're selling a relatively swift, clean victory. But independent military analysts, looking at the complex realities of these collapse scenarios, predict a maximum timeline of 1 to 3 months of high-intensity conflict. The consensus from the data is clear. This will not be a multi-year forever war involving hundreds of thousands of occupying ground troops, primarily because the strategy relies entirely on air power, precision decapitation, and internal collapse. But conversely, there is no instant overnight victory available either. It is going to be a grueling, volatile period.
It is a phenomenal, almost overwhelming amount of information to process. In the span of this deep dive, we have journeyed from the targeted assassination of the absolute top political and military leaders in Tehran to the stranding of massive container ships in the Gulf of Oman. We have connected the dots from a 900-bomb airstrike to the inflation numbers that will directly affect your ability to buy groceries or secure a mortgage next month. We have unpacked the terrifying math of an 86% drop in defensive capabilities and explored the wildly competing strategies of nations fighting for their ultimate survival. We want to genuinely thank you for joining us today as we untangled such a dense, complex, and globally shifting week of news.
Before we go, I want to leave you with one final, broader implication to chew on, building off what we discussed regarding the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. We noted that by closing that waterway, Iran is actively suffocating its own economy. They're destroying their primary source of income, accepting their own financial ruin, just to inflict pain on the global market and punish their adversaries.
It's essentially a policy of mutually assured economic destruction.
Exactly. And this raises a profound, deeply unsettling question about the future of global conflict. If a nation or a regime is willing to economically suffocate itself, if it's willing to accept total ruin just to inflict pain on the rest of the world, how do our traditional concepts of deterrence even work anymore? Historically, Western foreign policy relies on the idea that economic sanctions and the threat of isolation will force a rational actor to change their behavior, because survival and prosperity are the baseline goals. But if your adversary uses their own economic destruction as a weapon, if they weaponize their own suicide standard, geopolitical chess goes entirely out the window. What happens to our deeply interconnected, highly fragile, globalized world when mutually assured economic destruction is no longer a deterrent that prevents war, but a deliberate, offensive strategy used to wage it?
That is a chilling thought, and absolutely something you should keep in mind as you watch the headlines evolve and the gas prices fluctuate in the coming days. Deterrence only works if both sides want to survive. Keep questioning those easy narratives you see online, keep looking at the hard data, and we will be right here to unpack it all with you next time the tectonic plates shift. Until the next deep dive, take care.